On September 15, 2009, executioners tried to end Romell Broom's life by lethal injection. But after 2 agonizing hours of jabbing needles, piercing muscle and missing veins, he was still alive. His survival was not an act of mercy. It was a failure so brutal, so haunting, that it would come to define the dark side of capital punishment in America. But Romell Broom's story is just the beginning. Today on Execution Files, we uncover 6 shocking cases where death sentences went terribly wrong, from botched electric chairs to failed hangings, to history's first execution by nitrogen hypoxia. Stay with us until the end, because among these chilling stories, one man survived 8 gunshots and a bullet to the head, and lived to tell the tale. 1. Romell Broom, State, Ohio. 2-hour agony during botched execution. On September 15, 2009, Romell Broom's lethal injection was delayed for 2 hours as executioners repeatedly failed to find a vein. His execution was ultimately halted, and he lived for years longer than originally intended. Romell Broom's encounters with the law began early, marked by a string of juvenile offenses. But it was in 1975 that his actions turned darker, leading to convictions for serious assault and robbery. After spending nearly a decade in prison, he was paroled in 1984, only to reoffend within months. In September that year, Broom attempted to abduct a 12-year-old girl and days later, abducted 14-year-old Trina Middleton, tragically ending her life. His final arrest came after a failed abduction in December 1984, when brave bystanders helped authorities track him down. Broom's trial left little doubt about his guilt. Eyewitness testimonies and circumstantial evidence painted a clear picture. Though he offered to plead guilty for a lighter sentence, prosecutors pursued the death penalty. In December 1985, he was found guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. Decades later, a DNA test failed to exonerate him, merely suggesting that a few other individuals might share similar profiles. Courts upheld his conviction, and Broom remained one of Ohio's most infamous death row inmates. On September 15, 2009, officials tried to carry out Broom's execution by lethal injection. Yet after 18 agonizing attempts to find a suitable vein, the process was called off. No lethal drugs ever entered his system. Rather than abandoning the effort, Ohio set a new execution date, June 17, 2020. Broom and his attorneys launched a fierce legal battle, arguing that subjecting him to another execution attempt would violate his constitutional rights. Despite public outcry and legal objections, courts remained firm. The trauma of surviving an execution haunted Broom. Every day on death row became a relentless cycle of anxiety, fear, and dread. He even wrote a book about his survival after the execution. His lawyers argued that re-executing him would constitute cruel and unusual punishment, citing both physical and psychological suffering. However, the Ohio Supreme Court disagreed. As Justice Judith and Lanzinger wrote, because Broom's life was never at risk since the drugs were not introduced, it would not shock the public's conscience to allow the state to carry out Broom's execution. Broom remained trapped between life and death for over a decade. In the end, fate intervened before the state could. Romell Broom contracted COVID-19 while incarcerated and passed away in December 2020. 2. Allan Eugene Miller, State, Alabama, botched lethal injection attempt. On September 22, 2022, Allan Eugene Miller's lethal injection execution was interrupted after 2 hours of failed attempts to find a vein. The procedure was called off, leaving him severely injured before being returned to his cell. Allan Eugene Miller was convicted for the 1999 killings of 3 men, Lee Holdbrooks, Scott Yancey, and Terry Lee Jarvis. The tragic events unfolded after Miller believed these men were spreading harmful rumors about him. On August 5, 1999, Miller, in a fit of rage, shot and killed 2 of the men at his workplace before heading to another location, where he took the life of the 3rd victim. Despite a defense claiming mental illness, Miller was sentenced to death for his actions. During his trial, Miller's defense presented evidence of a mental illness diagnosis, specifically a delusional disorder. However, the court ruled that his condition did not meet the criteria for an insanity defense. In 2000, he was sentenced to death, and despite numerous appeals, his conviction was upheld. Allan Eugene Miller was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on September 22. However, the execution was called off after prison officials struggled to connect an 4-line to Miller, who weighed 351 pounds. For over an hour, staff repeatedly poked him with needles in an attempt to find a vein, but each effort failed. At one point, Miller was left hanging vertically while strapped to the gurney, his body contorted in pain as the team struggled to proceed. Despite these difficulties, no lethal drugs were administered, and the state postponed the execution, leaving Miller's fate uncertain. Miller's execution, which was meant to be carried out by lethal injection, was ultimately delayed and carried out using a controversial method, nitrogen gas. Alabama officials had reassured the public that death by nitrogen suffocation would be swift, with the individual losing consciousness almost immediately. However, the reality was far different. For nearly 2 minutes he struggled against the restraints, trembling and shaking uncontrollably. For about 6 minutes, Miller gasped for air, his body convulsing in distress. He wasn't pronounced dead until 6:38 p.m., a full 22 minutes after the gas began flowing. This haunting image of Miller's final moments remains a chilling reminder of the profound ethical questions surrounding the use of nitrogen gas in executions, and whether it can ever be truly considered a humane method of capital punishment. 3. Joseph Samuel, 3 failed hangings. On September 26, 1803, Joseph Samuel survived 3 failed hanging attempts when his rope broke 3 times. This was seen as a sign from God, and he was eventually released after public outcry. Joseph Samuel's involvement in crime began in August 1803, when he and a group of fellow convicts escaped from their camp and broke into the home of a wealthy woman, stealing 24 guineas and other items. The police were quickly notified, and a constable, Joseph Luker, went to investigate the crime. However, the next morning, Luker was found dead, and the circumstances of his death shocked the community. The investigation led to the arrest of Samuel, who confessed to the robbery but denied any involvement in the death of the constable. Despite his denial, Samuel was convicted of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. On September 26, 1803, Samuel, alongside another convict, James Hardwick, was brought to Parramatta for their public execution. As Samuel stood on the gallows, he surprised everyone by accusing another member of his gang, Simmons, of committing the murder. The crowd became agitated, and a brief commotion ensued. As the execution continued, Samuel devoted his final moments to prayer, and the executioner prepared to carry out the sentence. However, what followed was anything but ordinary. The noose was fastened around Samuel's neck with 5 cords of hemp, designed to hold up to 1,000 pounds. When the signal was given for the car to move away, the rope snapped, causing Samuel to fall to the ground. The executioner, embarrassed, quickly prepared a second rope and attempted to hang Samuel again. However, this time the noose slipped off, and Samuel's feet touched the ground once more, delaying the execution further. The crowd, increasingly unsettled, began to voice their confusion and concern, and the execution was halted. A third attempt was made, but again the rope failed and Samuel was left standing on the ground. This repeated failure caused such a stir that a police officer present ordered the execution to be delayed, calling for the governor to be summoned. The crowd, now convinced that something extraordinary was happening, saw the event as a sign of divine intervention. Samuel, having been given a second chance, must have been overwhelmed by the complexity of his situation, aware that fate had intervened in his life. However, after surviving 3 failed execution attempts, Joseph Samuel's fate seemed sealed, but his luck had run out. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he was sent to Kingstown, Newcastle, to work in the mines. However, in 1806, Samuel made one final attempt to escape. Along with 7 other men, he escaped the settlement by boat. The group was presumed to have drowned, and Samuel's body was never found. 4. Willie Francis, State, Louisiana, survived 2,000 volts of electricity. On May 3, 1946, Willie Francis was strapped into the electric chair, and felt 2,000 volts surge through his body during the execution. Miraculously, he survived, making it one of the most extraordinary failures in death penalty history. Willie Francis, a 16-year-old African-American from Street Martinville, Louisiana, was arrested for the murder of Andrew Thomas, a local pharmacist, in November 1944. After the crime, Francis was detained under suspicious circumstances and later confessed to the crime twice, though the validity of his confession has been questioned. His confession and the lack of proper legal counsel during the trial led to his conviction for capital murder. Despite his age, he was sentenced to death by electric chair and set to be executed in 1946. On May 3, 1946, Francis was brought to the electric chair, where the first attempt at execution would go terribly wrong. Willie Francis was brought to the Louisiana State Penitentiary to be executed in the infamous electric chair, known as Gruesome Gertie. The execution was set to be carried out at 12 p.m., but things went terribly wrong from the start. As the switch was thrown, it was clear that the electricity did not kill him. Witnesses reported hearing Francis scream from behind the leather hood,
"Take it off! Take it off! Let me breathe!"
The electric chair had failed to deliver the lethal surge needed to end his life. The reason for the malfunction was attributed to the improper setup of the chair, which had been handled by an intoxicated prison guard and an inmate. The electric current that passed through Francis's body was not strong enough to kill him, and instead he was left writhing in pain, his body contorting in response to the shocks. He was visibly shaken, and as the onlookers watched in horror, the sheriff Yale Ressweber was quoted as saying, "This boy really got a shock when they turned that machine on." After this agonizing experience, Francis was returned to his jail cell, alive but traumatized. The authorities, however, were determined to finish what they had started, and they set a new date for his execution. The failure of the first attempt only increased the urgency, and it would not be long before they would try again. The emotional toll of the failed execution weighed heavily on Willie, and his legal team argued that the state's actions had caused him immense suffering. People who witnessed the failed execution also spoke out about the brutality of the process. Finally, on May 9, 1947, Willie Francis was returned to the electric chair for his second execution attempt. Just before his death, he expressed a sense of peace and resigned himself to his fate. He told a reporter that he would meet his death with his Sunday pants and Sunday heart. At 12:10 p.m., the second attempt was carried out, and this time Willie was pronounced dead. The state's decision to go through with the execution, after the trauma of the first failed attempt, remains a symbol of the injustice and cruelty of the death penalty system. 5. Kenneth Smith, State, Alabama, the first to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia. On January 25, 2024, Kenneth Smith became the first person ever to be executed using nitrogen hypoxia, a method never before tried in the U.S. After surviving 2 previous botched execution attempts, his death by 25 minutes of violent shaking shocked the nation. Kenneth Smith was convicted for his role in the 1988 contract killing of Elizabeth Sennett in Colbert County, Alabama. The crime was orchestrated by Elizabeth's husband, Charles Sennett Sr., who hired Billy Gray Williams and Smith to murder his wife. On March 18, 1988, Smith and Parker entered the Sennett home, claiming to be there for a property survey. They ultimately murdered Elizabeth Sennett using a survival knife and various household items, leading to her tragic death. After the murder, Charles Sennett Sr. was overwhelmed by guilt and tragically took his own life. Smith and Parker were arrested, and Smith was convicted of capital murder. Smith was sentenced to death in 1989. Despite some opposition, his death sentence was upheld in a retrial in 1996, where the jury recommended life imprisonment, but the judge overruled them and imposed the death penalty. Kenneth Smith's trial was marked by significant legal flaws. His jury voted 11-1 in favor of a life sentence, but the judge overrode their recommendation and sentenced Smith to death. This controversial decision sparked debates about the fairness of judicial override practices in Alabama. Smith's case became a symbol of the flaws in the death penalty system, especially in light of the judge's power to overrule the jury's decision. Smith's defense team failed to properly challenge the evidence or present alternative defenses, and his sentencing was tainted by these shortcomings. Kenneth Smith's path to execution was fraught with complications. Initially scheduled for execution by lethal injection in November 2022, Smith's execution was called off after hours of failed attempts to connect the 4 lines. The prison execution team could not properly administer the lethal injection, and the execution was eventually halted. In response, Smith chose nitrogen hypoxia as his execution method, a relatively untested method that had never been used on a human. On January 25, 2024, Smith became the first person in the world to be executed using nitrogen hypoxia. The procedure involved Smith inhaling pure nitrogen through a mask, which was intended to cause suffocation. Despite state assurances that it would be a painless death, witnesses reported that Smith appeared to struggle, writhing and gasping for air for several minutes. The execution, which was intended to be swift and painless, took at least 22 minutes before Smith was pronounced dead. Surviving a failed execution left Smith with profound emotional scars. The botched lethal injection attempt in 2022 caused him severe pain and led to post-traumatic stress disorder. He feared that the second attempt would be just as painful, and the uncertainty of what was to come weighed heavily on him. Despite the legal efforts to halt his execution, including appeals from human rights organizations, Smith was forced to live in constant fear that he would face another painful death. His legal team worked tirelessly to prevent a second execution attempt, arguing that subjecting him to such a traumatic process would violate his constitutional rights. The UN and human rights experts condemned the use of nitrogen hypoxia, calling it inhumane and likely to result in cruel and degrading treatment. Despite these concerns, the state of Alabama moved forward with the execution, and Smith was executed by nitrogen hypoxia. Kenneth Smith's execution on January 25, 2024, marked a historic moment, as he became the first person ever to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia. Smith's final moments were marked by prolonged suffering, and the method failed to meet the expectations set by the state. 6. Weslow, Moguel, Mexico, shot 9 times in firing squad. On April 10, 1915, Weslow Moguel, also known as Wenceslaw Moguel, was shot 8 to 9 times, including a point-blank shot to the head, and miraculously survived. He later crawled away to safety and lived to recover from his injuries. Wenceslaw Moguel, a 25-year-old Mexican soldier, was captured during the Mexican Revolution on March 18, 1915, while allegedly fighting under Pancho Villa. Accused of being a rebel, he was arrested without a trial, a fate not uncommon during this tumultuous time. On that fateful day he was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. After being shot 8 to 9 times, including a final shot to the head at point-blank range, it was presumed that Moguel was dead. However, against all odds, he survived the execution. His story has become one of the most remarkable survival tales in history. After being captured, he and others were lined up and given a final cigarette before being executed. Moguel was blindfolded, and 8 soldiers shot him repeatedly. After falling to the ground, he received a final shot to the head, meant to ensure his death. It was assumed that he had died, but he managed to survive against all odds. As the soldiers moved on, Moguel crawled away from the execution site, determined to find help. 3 blocks away, he made his way to the Church of St. James Apostle, where a church member found him. The member immediately took him in, providing medical care and shelter. After being given medical attention, he managed to recover from the traumatic injuries that should have claimed his life. It is clear that Moguel's survival against the odds became a testament to his resilience and his extraordinary will to live. Wenceslaw Moguel lived for an astonishing 61 more years. In 1930, he moved to the United States, where his remarkable story began to gain attention. The public was fascinated by the man who had survived an execution that should have taken his life. His story became widely known, and he gained fame under the name The Shot One. He returned to Mexico later in life, where he lived quietly and peacefully, away from the limelight. Moguel passed away in 1976 at the age of 79, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire. Execution is supposed to be final, but when systems fail, they reveal something even darker than death itself. In these 6 haunting cases, we don't just see justice attempted. We see the cracks, the cruelty, and sometimes, the extraordinary will to survive against impossible odds. Which case unsettled you the most today? Let's talk about it in the comments below. We read every word. And don't forget to subscribe to Execution Files, where the final moments aren't the end of the story, but the beginning of the questions we have to ask.